Elena lunged at the coffin, clawing at the lid with bloodied fingernails. "You're burying him alive!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the church. Victor grabbed her arm, twisting it painfully. "Stop this madness!" "You're embarrassing yourself," he hissed, dragging her away as she fought wildly. "He's still alive in there. My husband is alive." Elena wailed as little Emma pointed at the coffin, her tiny voice cutting through the chaos. "Papa moving, Papa scared. What would you do if you thought your loved one was being buried alive? Comment below with your thoughts. Like and subscribe to find out if Elena is truly grief-stricken, or if something more sinister is happening. The truth will shock you. St. John's Church was shrouded in an atmosphere of mourning. The church bells tolled in long, solemn peals, blending with the muffled sobs of the grieving, creating a chilling, heart-wrenching feeling. Just moments before Elena's outburst, the funeral had been proceeding as expected, though with an undercurrent of confusion and whispers. Elena stood silently beside her husband's coffin, holding little Emma tightly in her arms. The 2-year-old struggled against her mother's grasp, her small face flushed red from crying too much. Elena bent down to soothe her, but Emma refused to be calmed. The child's innocent eyes were fixed on the wooden coffin where Thomas lay motionless. "Papa, Papa," Emma sobbed, her tiny fingers trembling as she pointed toward the coffin. Elena swallowed hard, her hands gripping the black mourning veil. She wanted to cry, but her tears were stuck in her throat. Thomas's sudden death still felt like a nightmare. Just yesterday he had kissed her before leaving the house, and now all that remained was a cold, lifeless body. Or so everyone believed. Around Elena the villagers gathered, whispering among themselves. No one understood how a healthy man like Thomas could die so suddenly. Some said it was an accident, while others murmured that it was fate's punishment. Mrs. Sullivan, an elderly woman who lived near Elena, stepped closer, her eyes filled with sympathy. She gently placed a hand on Elena's shoulder and whispered, "My dear, I know you're in pain, but little Emma—" Elena looked down at her daughter and saw that Emma was trembling, her wide eyes fixed on a dark corner behind the coffin. Suddenly the child let out a piercing scream. "Papa! Papa is trapped! He's calling for help!" The air inside the church grew thick with unease. A murmur spread through the crowd. Many exchanged nervous glances, while others hurriedly made the sign of the cross. Mrs. Sullivan took a shaky step back, covering her mouth with her hand. "My God, the child can see," she whispered in a voice full of dread. A chill ran down Elena's spine. She turned to Emma, trying to keep her voice steady. "Emma, what did you say?" she asked, though her heart was already pounding with fear. "Papa is there. He's calling for help, Mama. He's trapped," Emma insisted, still pointing toward the dark corner. A cold breeze swept through the church, making the altar candles flicker. No one spoke, but Elena could feel the tension thickening in the air. Just then, the church doors creaked open with a slow, eerie sound. A tall man stepped inside, his face stern. It was Victor, Thomas's cousin, dressed in a black suit. His dark eyes scanned the crowd before settling on Elena. He approached her with a sympathetic smile that felt strangely insincere. "Elena, you must be exhausted," Victor said, his voice deep and deceptively gentle. "We're all heartbroken over Thomas's passing." Elena only gave a slight nod, too drained to respond. Victor's gaze flickered to Emma, who was still clutching her mother's dress, staring intently at the dark corner. "The little one is too young to understand. It's best not to let her say such things. It might frighten people," he said, his tone carrying a subtle sharpness. Elena frowned slightly. His words unsettled her. "She's just grieving for her father," she replied, trying to remain composed. Victor nodded, but his expression quickly shifted. "Elena, I hate to bring this up now, but you know Thomas left behind a lot of financial trouble. Your house, it might be best to consider selling it to settle his debts." Elena froze, a wave of dizziness washing over her. "Sell the house? What are you talking about?" Victor sighed with faint concern. "Thomas was a good man, but he had his share of troubles. I'm just thinking about what's best for you and Emma." A cold dread seeped into Elena's bones. She had never trusted Victor, and now, before Thomas had even been laid to rest, he was already talking about money. Emma suddenly clung tighter to her mother's hand, her eyes glistening with tears. She pointed at the coffin again and spoke in a small yet clear voice. "Papa is trapped." Victor's head snapped around, his face momentarily frozen. The tension in the church thickened. Those standing nearby began inching away, no one daring to speak. Elena crouched down, her heart pounding in her chest. "Emma, what did you just say?" Emma looked up at her mother, her tiny face filled with fear. "Papa hasn't left. He's still here. He's calling for Mama." A suffocating silence settled over the church. A woman standing nearby, Sophia, tugged at another's sleeve and whispered, "This is not a good sign. A child so innocent wouldn't lie." Elena tightened her grip on Emma's little hand, trying to stop herself from trembling. Meanwhile, Victor clenched his jaw, his eyes flickering with unease. "Children have vivid imaginations," he forced a chuckle, but Elena noticed his hands balling into fists. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was, something wasn't right. Darkness crept through St. John's Church as the altar candles flickered weakly. The air felt heavier than ever after Emma's words. Those gathered around the coffin began stepping back, avoiding Elena and her daughter as if fearing what might come next. "Papa hasn't left. He's still here. He's calling for Mama." Emma's words echoed in Elena's mind, sending shivers down her spine. She scanned the crowd until her eyes landed on Victor, the man who had just urged her to sell the house. He still stood there, but his composure seemed to waver. His fingers tapped nervously against the wooden surface of a pew, and his eyes darted away. "Come now. Let's not let a child's words stir unnecessary fear," Victor said, forcing another weak smile. But there was a visible tremor in his voice. Mrs. Sullivan, the oldest in the village, silently made the sign of the cross before murmuring, "There are things beyond our understanding." Sometimes children can see what adults cannot. A shudder ran through Elena's body. She tightened her hold on Emma. Victor blinked rapidly, then turned back to Elena, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "Elena, I'm just trying to help. We should settle the matter of the house and assets before it's too late." "If Thomas were here, he'd want you to take care of everything quickly." Elena's stomach twisted into knots. "Can you leave me alone for a moment?" she said, her voice laced with steel. Victor shrugged, but a flicker of irritation crossed his face. "I'm only trying to help, but if you're too stubborn, I may have no choice but to involve the law." His veiled threat sent an icy chill down Elena's spine. Sophia clicked her tongue and whispered to the person beside her, "Absolutely heartless. The man hasn't even been buried yet, and he's already talking about assets." But Victor didn't seem to care about the murmurs around him. "I'll be back tomorrow. Hopefully by then you'll have thought things through," he said before turning and walking out of the church. Elena felt her heart pound, not just from his veiled threat, but from the way he reacted when Emma mentioned her father. Why had he looked so tense? She glanced down at Emma, who was still clinging tightly to her dress. "Mama, Papa is still here," Emma whispered. Elena took a deep breath, trying not to let panic take over. "Emma, what do you mean Papa is trapped?" Emma looked up at her mother with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Papa is stuck in there. He's calling me. He's scared." The words sent a chilling wave through Elena's body. She turned back toward the coffin. It was made of solid oak, the lid firmly sealed, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Beside her, Mrs. Sullivan shook her head and murmured, "The child isn't making things up. I've seen this before." Elena turned to her, her pulse racing. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Sullivan was silent for a moment before speaking in a hushed tone. "Many years ago there was a case. A man was thought to be dead, but he had only fallen into a deep coma. After they buried him, his family kept having nightmares about him, and then she trailed off, her expression haunted." Elena's throat went dry. She looked back at the coffin, a growing horror creeping into her mind. Emma hiccuped, then whispered, "Papa is calling me." In that moment, Elena felt her chest tighten. A shiver ran down her spine. No, it couldn't be. Thomas was dead, but was she absolutely sure? Outside, the wind howled through the stained glass windows, creating an eerie sound. The candles on the altar flickered, and then one of them went out. A few villagers exchanged anxious glances, murmuring among themselves. "This is a bad omen," a middle-aged woman whispered. The tension in the church rose like an approaching storm. Elena looked around, feeling as if the walls were closing in. What should she do? No, this was just a coincidence. But what about Thomas? Elena held Emma tightly, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. Sophia stepped closer and whispered, "Elena, if you have even the slightest doubt, don't let them bury Thomas just yet." The words hit Elena like a knife to the chest. She no longer knew what to believe, but one thing was certain. Something was very wrong. St. John's Church remained cloaked in darkness as the funeral stretched on longer than expected. The hushed whispers grew louder, filled with unease. The villagers exchanged anxious glances, stepping away from the coffin as if afraid to get too close. Elena stood frozen, her mind in turmoil, while Emma still clung to her, her innocent eyes filled with fear. "Elena, if you have even the slightest doubt, don't let them bury Thomas just yet." Sophia's words echoed in her head. Elena wanted to believe this was just the imagination of a grieving child, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was off. Victor had left, but the way he reacted when Emma spoke of her father made Elena more uneasy than ever. Mrs. Sullivan suddenly stepped closer, gently tugging at Elena's sleeve. "My dear, perhaps you should trust your instincts," she said, her voice low and serious. Elena looked down at her daughter. Emma's small hands clutched her dress, trembling. "Mama, Papa is scared," she whispered. A bone-chilling cold swept through Elena's veins. No, it wasn't possible. Thomas was dead. But what if he wasn't? The mere thought made it hard for Elena to breathe. She tightened her grip on Emma, struggling to find logic amidst the rumors, the fearful gazes of the villagers, and the ominous unease that hung in the air. Suddenly, from outside the church, a voice called out, breaking through Elena's spiraling thoughts. "Elena!" She turned sharply. Standing at the entrance was Oliver, a close friend of Thomas. He was panting, his face tense with urgency. "I just heard. I got here late, but there's something you need to know." Elena frowned, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. What could be so important? Oliver strode toward her, lowering his voice. Before he died, he mentioned something important. I don't know if this is the right time, but it has to do with Victor. Hearing Victor's name made Elena even more uneasy. "Tell me," she said firmly. Oliver glanced around as if making sure no one was eavesdropping, then leaned in closer. "A few days before Thomas passed, he told me Victor kept pressuring him to sell the house. Thomas refused, and the next day he had his accident." A wave of ice washed over Elena. She recalled Victor's words from earlier, the way he urgently pushed her to sell the house, the way he tried to remain calm when Emma spoke about Thomas being trapped. Could it be that this wasn't an accident? Elena's hands trembled. "Oliver, are you saying?" Oliver swallowed hard. "I have no proof, but Thomas never trusted Victor. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, you shouldn't trust anyone." Elena felt like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. No, it couldn't be. But a growing suspicion was taking root in her mind. And that's when it happened. The moment that would change everything. Emma's tiny finger pointed directly at the coffin as she screamed, "Papa moving!" And Elena, driven by maternal instinct and a desperate fear, lunged forward toward the coffin, determined to see for herself if the impossible could be true. But the pieces were beginning to fit together in a terrifying way. Emma suddenly yanked at Elena's sleeve, her eyes wide with fear. "Mama, Papa is crying!" The entire church fell into a stunned silence. Mrs. Sullivan took a step back. Others in the crowd looked at each other in growing dread. "The child. She can really see him," someone murmured. Elena swallowed hard and turned to Emma. Emma? What did you say? Emma pointed at the coffin, her voice barely above a whisper. Papa is crying. Papa is crying inside. The cold room suddenly became suffocating. Elena felt the blood in her veins freeze. No, it couldn't be. But then a faint sound echoed from the coffin. Thud. No one spoke. No one dared to move. Was it just an illusion? Then the sound came again. Thud. Thud. This time it wasn't just Elena who heard it. The crowd started to stir. Mrs. Sullivan trembled, making the sign of the cross over and over. "Dear God," she whispered. Sophia stammered. "Elena, we should open the coffin." Elena couldn't breathe, but just as she was about to step forward, a voice rang out. "No one is to touch it." Everyone turned. Victor had returned. He stood at the entrance of the church, his eyes burning with anger. "Don't let superstition cause chaos. This is ridiculous." But Elena couldn't shake the growing dread. She looked around. The villagers were trembling, their eyes shifting between fear and doubt. Thud. Thud. Another sound. Elena's face turned pale. Victor clenched his fists, his voice laced with a dangerous warning. "No one is opening that coffin." But his very words only made Elena more certain. He was afraid of something. St. John's Church was silent, but fear spread through it like a raging storm. The knocking from the coffin left everyone frozen in place. The flickering candles on the altar cast trembling shadows on the cold stone walls. Elena felt her heart nearly stop. She stared at the oak coffin, the place where Emma had just said Thomas was crying. "No one is opening the coffin." Victor's voice rang out sharp and frantic. "Everyone, calm down. It's just the wind, just the wood contracting from the weather." But no one believed him. "Wood contracting makes knocking sounds," Mrs. Sullivan whispered, her eyes haunted. An elderly man, William, a longtime friend of Thomas's father, stood up, his voice firm and unwavering. "Victor, why are you afraid of opening the coffin if you have nothing to hide? Let us check." "I'm not afraid of anything," Victor nearly shouted, but Elena noticed how his hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Oliver stepped forward, his eyes sharp as a blade. "Then let us open it." Thud. The coffin knocked again. Several women in the village shrieked, clutching onto one another. The somber funeral had transformed into a living nightmare. Emma clung to her mother's dress, tears welling in her big eyes. "Mama, Papa is calling you." Elena trembled, but something inside her was burning. She looked up at Victor, her unease turning into a deep, unsettling certainty. "What are you hiding, Victor?" she demanded, her voice rough with emotion. Victor's eyes widened. "Are you insane, Elena? You want to open a coffin just because of a child's nonsense? And what about the knocking?" Elena shot back. "The wind. I told you it's just the wind." He nearly roared. "Then let us open it and prove you're right," Oliver interrupted, stepping forward. No one spoke. The entire church held its breath. Victor swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the coffin as if it were a monster. "No!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "No one is to touch it." But his outburst only condemned him further. William stepped forward, his old yet commanding voice cutting through the tension. "Victor, if you keep resisting, you're only making yourself look more suspicious." Victor glared at him, his lips pressed into a tight line. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. Suddenly, Emma let out a piercing scream. "Papa! Papa! I'm here!" Her cry echoed through the church. Elena felt the floor beneath her feet tremble. Thud. The knocking grew louder, too loud to be an illusion. Some villagers panicked, fleeing toward the door, while others remained rooted in place, their eyes wide with horror. Sophia clutched at her shawl, her voice shaking. "If something is wrong, we have to check now." Mrs. Sullivan took a deep breath and spoke slowly. "Call the priest. If there is a trapped soul, he may be able to help." The mention of the priest made Victor go even paler. "No, no one is calling anyone," he barked. But Elena had had enough of the lies. She turned to Oliver, her voice firm and unyielding. "Go get Father David right now." Victor lunged forward, trying to stop Oliver, but William grabbed his shoulder, gripping him tightly. "You have no right to interfere anymore, Victor." His voice was cold. Smack! Victor jerked his arm free, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. Outside, the church bells tolled heavily, their echoes vibrating through the funeral hall. Oliver ran off to fetch the priest, while inside the church, Elena stood frozen before her husband's coffin, her heart pounding. Emma hiccuped, whispering through her tears. "Papa is waiting for Mama to open the door for him." A shiver ran down Elena's spine. Were her daughter's words true, or was this just the imagination of a grieving child? But then what about the knocking? Victor was definitely hiding something. Elena scanned the room, seeing the fear-stricken faces of the villagers. Everyone understood this was no ordinary funeral. Mrs. Sullivan pressed her hands together in desperate prayer. Sophia gripped her cloak tightly, murmuring, "If Thomas isn't dead, then maybe we still have time to save him." But what if it was too late? That thought stabbed through Elena's mind like a dagger. She couldn't wait any longer. Whether the priest arrived or not, whether Victor tried to stop them or not, she would uncover the truth. The church bells continued to toll, their heavy chimes reverberating through the grief-stricken air. No one was mourning Thomas anymore. Terror had consumed them all. Thud, thud. The knocking from the coffin continued, louder, more desperate. Elena felt her entire body freeze, but her mind was screaming. Was Thomas still alive? It couldn't be. But what if he was? Cold sweat dripped down her back as her trembling hand gripped Emma's tightly. The little girl was sobbing, her face stricken with fear. "Mama, Papa is calling for help." Mrs. Sullivan whispered a desperate prayer while the villagers edged away, too afraid to approach the coffin but unable to look away. Oliver had gone to fetch the priest, but Elena knew she couldn't wait any longer. "We have to open the coffin now." Her voice was clear, unwavering, but it struck like a bolt of lightning. "No!" Victor roared, charging forward, his eyes wild with panic. "Are you insane, Elena? This is ridiculous superstition. Who opens a coffin in the middle of a funeral?" Elena spun around, locking eyes with him. "Then explain it, Victor." "What are those sounds?" Victor clenched his fists, his voice cracking with panic. "The wind! I told you, it's just the wind!" "Do you think I'm stupid enough to believe that?" Elena roared, her eyes burning with fury. Victor opened his mouth to say something, but just then Oliver appeared at the church doors. "The priest is on his way," he said. "No one is to touch the coffin until he arrives." "No," Elena shouted. "I can't wait another second." She lunged toward the coffin, reaching for the lid, but Victor suddenly rushed forward, grabbing her wrist. "Elena, don't be foolish," he growled, squeezing so tightly that pain shot through her arm. "Let me go, Victor." The entire church gasped in horror at Victor's aggression, but he continued to shout, "You can't open it. It's disrespectful to the dead." "Or are you afraid of something?" Elena's words cut through Victor like a blade. He froze, taking advantage of his hesitation. Elena shoved him away and marched toward Thomas's coffin. Oliver and William stepped forward as well. "If Thomas is truly dead, we'll see it for ourselves. But if he isn't—" William's voice was ice-cold. Victor's face turned ghostly pale. "No," he screamed. But this time, no one listened. Elena placed her hands on the coffin lid. Beside her, Emma whispered through her tears, "Papa." She took a deep breath. She was ready to open it, but then, slap! Victor's hand shot out, striking Elena hard across the face. A collective gasp of horror echoed through the church. Elena stumbled back, her head spinning from the impact. Is this real or just mass hysteria? What would you do? Time is running out for Thomas. Subscribe now to see if they open the coffin in time, or if it's already too late. The shocking truth will be revealed soon. Oliver roared, lunging forward and grabbing Victor by the collar. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Victor struggled, but Oliver landed a brutal punch to his face, sending him crashing to the floor. But Elena wasn't focused on them anymore. Her hands remained on the coffin, and the knocking inside hadn't stopped. Thud, thud. Tears streamed down Emma's cheeks. "Mama, Papa is knocking." Elena clenched her jaw, her chest tightening with overwhelming tension. She didn't care about Victor anymore. She didn't care about anyone's objections. She was going to open the coffin. She had to know the truth. Thud, thud. The knocking continued, louder now, reverberating through the entire church. No one could deny it anymore. There was something inside that coffin. Elena's heart pounded like a war drum. She gripped the lid tightly, inhaling sharply. "Open it," her voice rang out, clear and resolute. But just as she prepared to lift the lid, a voice screamed, "No!" Victor lunged forward like a rabid animal, his eyes bloodshot, his face contorted with pure terror. "No one opens the coffin! Leave Thomas alone!" Smack! Oliver delivered another crushing punch, sending Victor sprawling onto the cold stone floor. He writhed in pain, but he still shrieked like a madman. "Don't open it!" Elena trembled with rage. "What are you so afraid of, Victor?" "I'm not afraid of anything," Victor screamed, thrashing like a man possessed. "You don't understand. Don't open it. Don't open it. Don't open it." But Elena had no patience left. She turned to Oliver and William. They nodded. Her hands shook, but her resolve was unshaken. She placed both hands firmly on the coffin lid. Beside her, Emma sobbed, gripping her mother's dress. "Mama, Papa is scared." Elena bit her lip hard. She was about to lift the lid, but "Elena, stop!" A deep voice boomed from the entrance of the church. Everyone turned. Father David had arrived. His long black robes fluttered slightly as he stepped forward, his face grave and tense. "What are you all doing?" Oliver quickly approached him. "Father, something is wrong. There are noises coming from the coffin. We have to open it." The priest slowly walked forward, his piercing gaze scanning the fearful faces of the villagers before settling on Elena. "Are you sure, Elena?" Her breath hitched. Was she sure? Beside her, Emma clutched her hand tighter, her teary eyes glistening. Papa is scared." Her daughter's words sliced through Elena's heart. She took a shaky breath and looked straight at the priest. "I'm not sure," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I can't bury Thomas with doubt in my heart." Father David nodded solemnly. He stepped toward the coffin. The church was deathly silent. No one even dared to breathe. The priest reached out and lightly touched the lid. A suffocating stillness filled the room, and then, thud, thud, another knock, louder, more frantic. Mrs. Sullivan screamed, and several villagers bolted for the door in sheer terror. Victor writhed on the ground, mumbling like a lunatic. "Don't open it. Don't open it. You'll regret this," but no one was listening to him anymore. Elena met the priest's gaze. He nodded. "Open it. But wait!" A voice suddenly rang out from the church entrance. Everyone turned in shock. A man burst in, panting heavily, his clothes disheveled as if he had run a great distance. It was Dr. Reynolds, the county medical examiner. "Stop!" he shouted. "Do not open that coffin." The entire church froze. Elena's eyes widened in disbelief. "Why?" she choked out. Dr. Reynolds rushed forward, his face drenched in sweat. There's been a mistake," he gasped. "I checked Thomas's death certificate, and something isn't right." No one made a sound. Oliver's fists clenched. "What are you saying?" The medical examiner swallowed hard, his expression grim. "The death certificate was signed by a doctor I don't recognize. I checked with the hospital, and no one officially confirmed Thomas's death." The air in the church turned to ice. Elena felt her entire body go numb. Victor let out a strangled wail like a cornered animal. "No, no, no." Oliver tightened his fists, his voice like thunder. "What does that mean?" Dr. Reynolds turned to Elena, his voice heavy as a tombstone. "It means there's a chance Thomas was never dead." Elena's knees buckled, and she grasped the edge of the coffin for support. It was too much to process. If Thomas wasn't dead, then what was he? And if he was still alive, how is that possible? Father David asked, his voice trembling slightly. Dr. Reynolds shook his head. I don't know yet, but someone would have had to forge the certificate. All eyes turned to Victor, who was now trying to crawl toward the church doors. Oliver stepped forward, blocking his path. You did this, didn't you? He growled, towering over Victor's crumpled form. I didn't know, Victor whimpered, his face contorted with fear. I just wanted the house. I didn't know he would. You didn't know what? Elena demanded, taking a step toward him. What did you do to my husband? Victor's face crumpled. It was just supposed to scare him, make him sell. I didn't mean for it to go this far. William moved forward, his elderly frame suddenly imposing. You poisoned him. Just to make him sick, Victor whispered. Not to kill him. The doctor said it would just make him weak for a few days. But then he collapsed, and he wouldn't wake up. Elena felt a wave of nausea wash over her. You tried to kill Thomas for money. No, Victor cried out. I swear, I didn't want him dead. The doctor said he'd just be sick, but then he wasn't waking up, and we had to do something. We, Father David asked, his voice sharp. Victor's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. Dr. Kemp, he said Thomas was just in a deep sleep, that he'd wake up eventually, but he was taking too long, and people were asking questions. Elena's blood ran cold. So you decided to bury him alive? We thought he was dead by then, Victor wailed. Victor wailed. He wasn't breathing. At least, that's what Dr. Kemp said. Thud, thud. The sound from the coffin was unmistakable now. Emma clutched at her mother's dress. Mama, please. Papa needs air. That was all Elena needed to hear. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she gripped the coffin lid and flung it open. The entire church held its breath. Thomas lay inside, his face ghostly pale, his body rigid, but his fingers were twitching. His eyelids fluttered ever so slightly. Thomas! Elena screamed, reaching into the coffin. He's alive! Oliver shouted. Someone call an ambulance! Elena cradled Thomas's face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Thomas, can you hear me? Please hold on. His lips parted slightly, the faintest whisper escaping. Elena. Emma pressed her small face against the edge of the coffin. Papa, wake up! Father David was already on his phone, urgently calling for medical help. The villagers crowded around, some weeping, others praying fervently. Mrs. Sullivan's aged hands trembled as she made the sign of the cross. A miracle, she whispered. The child truly saw. Oliver and William had pinned Victor to the ground, preventing him from escaping. Dr. Reynolds rushed to the coffin, checking Thomas's vital signs. His pulse is weak, but it's there, he announced. We need to get him to a hospital immediately. Elena could barely process what was happening. Thomas was alive. Her husband, whom she had been preparing to bury, was alive. And Victor, his own cousin, had done this to him. Why? And Victor, his own cousin, she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at Victor. Why would you do this? Victor's face was a mask of misery. The house, the land, it was supposed to be mine. My father always said it should have gone to him, not Thomas's father. I was just taking back what belonged to our side of the family. The raw selfishness of his words struck Elena like a physical blow. This man had been willing to destroy their family, to orphan a child, all for property. You will pay for this, she said, her voice low but filled with a cold fury that made Victor shrink back. Outside, sirens wailed as an ambulance approached. Dr. Reynolds continued to monitor Thomas, whose breathing was becoming more visible. He's been drugged with something powerful, the doctor explained. It must have slowed his bodily functions to the point where he appeared dead. It's rare, but it happens. The body goes into such a deep state of suspended animation that even medical professionals can mistake it for death. Emma touched her father's cheek gently. Papa, you're going to be okay now. Mama saved you. Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward her daughter. Without Emma's innocent ability to see what the adults could not, Thomas would have been buried alive. The thought sent a shudder of horror through her body. The paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. As they carefully transferred Thomas from the coffin, his eyes opened fully for the first time, finding Elena's in that moment. Despite all of the chaos, a silent understanding passed between them. They had been given a second chance. As Thomas was wheeled out, Elena followed closely, holding Emma in her arms. Behind them, Oliver and William handed Victor over to the police, who had arrived with the ambulance. Standing at the doorway of the church, Elena looked back one last time at the open, empty coffin, the wooden box that had almost become her husband's early grave. Then she stepped out into the daylight, following the ambulance that carried Thomas toward life, not death. The nightmare wasn't over yet. Thomas was still fighting for his life, and the full extent of Victor's crimes was yet to be uncovered. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Elena felt something she had thought was lost forever. "Hope I don't recognize," Dr. Reynolds continued, his face pale with shock. "I checked with the hospital, and no one officially confirmed Thomas's death." The air in the church turned to ice. Elena felt her entire body go numb. Victor let out a strangled wail like a cornered animal. "No, no, no, no!" Oliver tightened his fists, his voice like thunder. "What does that mean?" Dr. Reynolds turned to Elena, his voice heavy as a tombstone. "It means there's a chance Thomas was never dead." The entire church erupted in gasps and cries. Elena collapsed to her knees, clutching Emma. Emma sobbed, whispering, "Mama, I told you." Elena's eyes widened, her trembling hands clenched her daughter's dress. She turned to the coffin. Her hand reached for the lid. She was going to open it, but no. Victor lunged forward like a madman, screaming hysterically, and the church doors suddenly slammed shut. Everything plunged into darkness. Bang! The church doors slammed shut, plunging everything into darkness. Terrified screams erupted. A few villagers shoved each other, desperately trying to escape, but the doors were locked tight. The heavy scent of damp stone, burning candles, and the rapid breathing of dozens of people mixed together, creating a suffocating, almost unbearable atmosphere. Elena clutched Emma tightly, feeling the child's small body trembling. "Mama? Mama?" Emma's voice was so small it was almost inaudible. Elena squeezed her daughter's hand, her heart pounding violently. "It's okay, baby. Mama's here." Suddenly, a voice shrieked in the darkness. "We can't stay here. We need to open the doors." A man rushed forward, banging on the church doors, but they wouldn't budge. "Who locked the doors?" Someone cried out. Oliver pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. Mrs. Sullivan began trembling, whispering frantic prayers under her breath. "This is an omen. A punishment." Elena fought to stay calm, but she knew something was terribly wrong. "Someone please open the doors!" A woman screamed, but no one responded. Then, ha ha ha! A crazed, maniacal laughter rang through the darkness. Everyone turned at once. Victor. He stood in the middle of the church, sweat dripping down his face, his bloodshot eyes filled with madness. "Don't open the coffin! Don't open it!" He howled, but his voice, once commanding, was now weak with desperation. Father David stepped forward, his tone firm. "Victor, what do you know about this?" Victor staggered back, shaking his head violently. "No, no! Don't ask me! Don't ask!" Oliver stormed toward him, grabbing him by the collar. "What did you do to Thomas?" Victor broke down, but this time he was no longer the arrogant, controlling man he had been. He crumpled to the floor, his entire body shaking. I didn't mean to." Elena clenched her fists, her voice razor-sharp. "What did you do?" Victor sobbed, his words barely comprehensible. "I just wanted what was mine. I just wanted Thomas to sell the house, but he refused. He said he'd never sell it." A cold shiver ran down Elena's spine. "So you killed him?" "No," Victor screamed, then collapsed into helpless sobs. "I didn't kill him. I only wanted to scare him. I put something in his drink just to knock him out, but he never woke up." The entire church was paralyzed with horror. Elena felt the world spin. a deafening ringing in her ears. "You drugged my husband?" Victor nodded, sweat dripping from his brow. "I didn't know he was allergic. I didn't know. When I realized he wasn't waking up, I panicked." "So you forged the death certificate," Oliver growled. Victor shuddered. "I had no other choice. I bribed the doctor to fake the paperwork." "I thought he was already dead, you thought?" Elena's voice cracked, her fists trembling. "You didn't even check." Victor cowered, unable to meet her gaze. I was too afraid." "And you let them bury him?" Victor sobbed uncontrollably, but there was no pity left for him. No, I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't know. I never thought." But he couldn't finish his sentence because at that exact moment, bang, 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 bang. The pounding inside the coffin grew so violent the entire church trembled. A chorus of screams erupted. Victor's eyes bulged, his face drained of all color. "No, no, it can't be." Father David made the sign of the cross before commanding, "Open the coffin." Elena took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking, but she knew this was the most important moment of her life. She turned to Oliver and nodded. "Do it!" Oliver and William stepped forward, placing their hands on the coffin lid. A chilling wind swept through the church. Victor shrieked in panic, "No! Don't open it! Don't open it!" But it was too late. Oliver and William lifted the coffin lid. A heart-wrenching cry tore from Elena's throat. "Thomas!" The coffin was open. Elena fell to her knees, her vision blurred by tears. Thomas was there. He was alive. His body trembled. His skin was ghostly pale. His lips cracked from dehydration. His eyes fluttered open, weak but unmistakably conscious. "Thomas!" Elena screamed, rushing to him, her hands trembling as they touched his face. "Thomas, I'm here! I'm here!" Emma burst into tears, sobbing, "Papa! Papa! I'm here!" A faint breath escaped his lips. Elena's gasps and cries of shock filled the church. Thomas was not dead. He had been buried alive. The villagers recoiled in horror. Some women wept in disbelief. Others covered their mouths in shock. Oliver ripped off his coat and wrapped it around Thomas. "Quick! We need to get him help." Father David knelt beside Thomas, gripping his hand. His voice was calm but urgent. "Someone bring water." Sophia sprinted toward the back of the church, searching for water. Elena sobbed, her tears falling onto Thomas's hand. "Don't leave me, Thomas. Don't leave Emma. Please." Emma clutched her father's arm, her tiny hands squeezing tightly as she hiccuped between sobs. Thomas's lips trembled as if he wanted to speak, but he was too weak. Then suddenly, a shriek cut through the chaos. "No, no, this is a demon!" Everyone turned. Victor was crawling across the church floor, his face twisted in sheer terror. "No, Thomas is dead. He has to be dead." Oliver's fury exploded. He lunged at Victor, delivering a brutal punch that sent him sprawling to the ground. "Shut the hell up!" Victor whimpered, but still screamed like a madman. "No, no! Thomas can't be alive!" Elena rose to her feet, her eyes burning with rage. "Why are you so afraid, Victor?" Her voice was sharp and cutting. Victor sobbed, backing away, his entire body trembling. I didn't mean to," William roared. "You buried him alive." The villagers gasped, their fear shifting into righteous fury. Some looked horrified, others furious at the monstrous truth that had just been revealed. Mrs. Sullivan clutched her rosary, tears streaming down her aged face. "He is the devil! He is truly the devil!" Sophia hissed. "Call the police!" "This crime cannot go unpunished." Father David nodded, signaling to Oliver. "We must get Thomas outside. He needs urgent care." Oliver and several village men carefully lifted Thomas from the coffin. Elena grasped her husband's hand, her voice breaking. "Thomas, hold on. You have to live." Emma sniffled, patting her father's face with her small hands. "Papa, wake up. I miss you so much." Thomas let out a weak breath, his tear-filled eyes meeting Elena's. He had heard everything. He had nearly been buried alive, and his own daughter had saved him. Outside, sirens blared. 2 police cars screeched to a stop in front of the church, followed by an ambulance. Sheriff Jenkins stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the shaking crowd. "What the hell is going on here?" Oliver rushed forward, yelling, "Victor tried to kill Thomas. He bribed a doctor, faked the death certificate, and buried him alive." The entire church erupted in confirming cries. Sheriff Jenkins turned to Victor, his face ice cold. "Arrest him immediately." 2 officers stormed forward, yanking Victor to his feet. "No, no, I'm innocent! I'm innocent!" Victor thrashed wildly, but the officers tightened the handcuffs and forced him down onto the cold floor. "You will pay for everything you've done," Oliver growled. Sheriff Jenkins turned to Elena, his voice deep and firm. "We will conduct a full investigation. Thomas will be taken to the hospital immediately." Elena nodded, tears still streaming down her face. She turned back to Thomas, feeling his weak breaths against her skin. But there was now a glimmer of light in his eyes. "You're going to live, Thomas. You're going to live." Emma smiled, her tiny hands wrapped around her father's. "Papa, can we go home?" Thomas's lips parted, his voice hoarse but filled with love. "Yes, let's go home." County Memorial Hospital. 3 days later, the early morning sun filtered through the hospital window, casting a soft glow on Thomas's face. His breathing was steadier now, his hollow cheeks slightly fuller, though his eyes were still heavy with emotion as he gazed at Elena and Emma sitting beside him. "Papa?" Emma jumped onto the hospital bed, wrapping her small arms around him. Her tiny hands gently traced his face as if making sure he was real. "Papa, you're back!" Thomas gave a weak smile, his gaze brimming with warmth. "I'm sorry, my love." His voice was rough, but each word was filled with emotion. Elena gripped his hand tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Do you know how scared we were?" Thomas nodded slowly, his expression filled with sorrow. "I heard everything." Elena froze. "What do you mean?" Thomas took a deep breath, his voice thick with emotion. "When I was trapped in that coffin, I couldn't move. I couldn't scream, but I heard you. I heard Emma. I heard Victor lying. Dear God," Elena sobbed, throwing her arms around him. Emma clung to his arm, her voice pure and bright. "But Mama saved you. I heard you calling me, Papa." Thomas looked at his daughter, his eyes misty. "Thank you, my little angel." Emma beamed and hugged him tightly. Outside the hospital room, Oliver and Father David waited as Elena stepped out. Oliver approached, his voice steady. "Victor has been locked up. He's going to trial." Elena nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. Father David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his voice calm and reassuring. Thomas was saved. That is what matters most. Elena took a deep breath, then gave a faint smile. "Yes, what matters most is that he's alive." Dr. Reynolds approached them, his face serious but relieved. "Thomas is making remarkable progress. We've identified the substance Victor used, a powerful sedative that, combined with Thomas's allergic reaction, created a state resembling death. It's extremely rare, but it happens." "The Lazarus syndrome," Father David murmured. Dr. Reynolds nodded. "In a way, yes. Thomas's vital signs were so suppressed that even Dr. Kemp thought he was dead, or at least claimed to think so. We found Dr. Kemp, by the way. He was trying to leave the country." "What will happen to him?" Elena asked. "He'll face charges for his part in this," Oliver assured her. "Medical malpractice, falsifying documents, criminal negligence. He won't practice medicine ever again." Elena shuddered, thinking how close she had come to losing Thomas forever. "And the property?" "Victor said that's why he did this." Oliver's expression softened. The property dispute was Victor's obsession, not reality. "I've looked into it. There was never any legal claim from Victor's side of the family. Thomas's ownership was always completely legitimate." "So this was all for nothing," Elena whispered. the tragedy of it striking her anew. "Greed and jealousy rarely make sense," Father David said softly. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Elena, there's something else you should know. Thomas may have some lingering trauma from this experience. Being conscious while presumed dead, hearing everything but unable to respond. It takes a toll psychologically." Elena's heart sank. "Will he recover?" "With time and support, yes, but it won't be easy." Elena straightened her shoulders. "We'll face it together, all of us." As she returned to Thomas's room, Elena found him watching Emma draw a picture. The little girl was chattering happily, explaining her artwork to her father, who smiled despite his exhaustion. "She hasn't left your side," Elena said, sitting beside them. Thomas reached for her hand. "Neither have you." "I never will again." County Courthouse. 1 week later, the courtroom was packed, filled with villagers who had come to witness justice being served. Victor was led in, his hands shackled tightly. His face was gaunt, his eyes filled with fear. The prosecutor read the charges, each word slicing through the air like a blade. The defendant, Victor Ramirez, is charged with attempted murder, falsification of a death certificate, and the deliberate burial of a living person, Thomas Morrison. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom, but Elena remained focused on one thing: Victor. He no longer looked smug or powerful. Now, he was nothing more than a coward trembling in the face of his fate. The court will now deliver the sentence. "Wait!" A voice rang out. Everyone turned. Thomas stood there, leaning on a cane, but his gaze was steady and resolute. He locked eyes with Victor, his voice calm but piercing. "I have something to say before the court sentences him." The judge nodded, motioning for him to proceed. Thomas stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Victor, I don't hate you." The entire courtroom fell silent. "But I despise you." Thomas's voice was sharp as steel. "You betrayed our family. You betrayed your own honor. And now you will face the consequences." Victor collapsed to his knees, sobbing, but no one felt pity for him. The judge struck the gavel. "The defendant, Victor Ramirez, is hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison." Applause erupted, but Elena only closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The nightmare was finally over. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for a statement. Thomas, with Elena and Emma beside him, faced the cameras. "This has been a nightmare for our family," he said, "but we're stronger for having survived it. What happened to me was horrific, but I'm alive because of the unshakable love and faith of my wife and daughter." He squeezed Emma's hand. "Especially this little one, who somehow knew I wasn't gone." "Mr. Morrison," one reporter called out, "what was it like, being conscious in the coffin?" Thomas tensed, and Elena stepped forward protectively. "That's enough questions for today." As they walked away, Dr. Reynolds approached them. "Thomas, Elena, I have news about Dr. Kemp." "What is it?" Thomas asked. "He's made a full confession. He admits that he knew you weren't dead, but Victor threatened him. Still, that doesn't excuse what he did." Elena shook her head, disgust evident in her expression. "How could a doctor betray his oath that way?" "Greed," Dr. Reynolds said simply. "Victor paid him a substantial amount." Thomas sighed. "At least justice will be served there, too." Dr. Reynolds nodded. "He'll never practice medicine again. His license has been permanently revoked, and he's facing significant jail time." As they drove home, Emma fell asleep in the back seat, her small face peaceful for the first time in weeks. Elena reached over and took Thomas's hand. "How are the nightmares?" she asked softly. Thomas squeezed her hand. "Better. Not gone, but better. We'll get through this," she promised. "All of us together." The Morrison home. 1 month later, the Morrison home was bathed in golden sunlight. Thomas stood on the porch, looking out at the vast fields, his hand clasped firmly in Elena's. Emma ran across the yard, her laughter ringing through the air. "We're really home," Elena whispered. Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with peace. "Thank you. Thank you both." Elena rested her head on his shoulder, her heart finally at ease. Thomas squeezed her hand, whispering, "I will never leave you and Emma again." Emma ran up to them, throwing her arms around both of them. "We're a family. No one can take us apart anymore." Elena smiled brightly, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead. "That's right, my love. We will always be together." The sun shone down on them, illuminating a new beginning. Later that evening, as they sat together on the porch swing, Thomas turned to Elena. "I've been thinking about what happened, about what it all means." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, watching Emma play with her dolls nearby. "Everything that happened. Victor's betrayal, my near death, Emma's ability to sense I was still alive. It's taught me something I never understood before." "What's that?" Thomas looked at Emma, then back at Elena. "There are connections between us that go beyond what we can explain. Emma knew I was alive when medical science said I was dead. You trusted her when everyone else thought it was just a child's imagination. That trust, that deep connection, it saved my life." Elena took his hand. "Love sees what science can't." "Exactly," Thomas nodded. "We live in a world that values evidence, facts, proofs. But some of the most important truths can't be measured or proven. They can only be felt." They watched as Emma played in the last rays of sunlight, her innocence and joy a stark contrast to the darkness they had endured. "You know," Thomas continued, "before this happened, I was always so focused on work, on providing, on the future. I missed so many little moments with you and Emma because I was always thinking about tomorrow." "And now?" Elena asked softly. "Now I understand that tomorrow isn't guaranteed. What matters is right now. This moment, this breath, this life we share together. When I was in that coffin, unable to move or speak, all I could think about were the moments I'd wasted, the times I'd put off telling you I loved you, the bedtime stories I was too busy to read to Emma." Elena wiped away a tear. "But you have a second chance now." Thomas nodded, his voice full of emotion. "Yes, and I won't waste it. None of us should waste the time we have with the people we love." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas pulled Elena and Emma close, their faces illuminated by the soft porch light. "This experience has taught me that truth cannot remain buried forever. In the end, justice prevails. But more importantly, it's shown me that a child's intuition and a mother's love are among the strongest forces in this world." Emma never doubted. "She knew I was there, and you believed her when no one else would." Elena smiled through her tears. "Children see with their hearts, not just their eyes." "Yes," Thomas agreed, "and that sight saved me. This tale proves that the truth cannot remain buried forever, and in the end, justice prevails." Elena and Emma never gave up. And because of their unwavering love, Thomas was saved, and the villain was brought to justice. It teaches us that a mother's intuition and the love of family are the strongest forces in the world. At the same time, it warns against greed and deception, for no matter how well one hides their crimes, they will always face the consequences. In our modern world, we often dismiss what we cannot explain scientifically. The intuition of a child, the deep knowing of a parent, the connections that bind families together across time and space. But this story reminds us that some of the most profound truths lie beyond the reach of science, in the realm of love, intuition, and faith. It also shows us the power of presence, of truly being there for those we love, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Thomas discovered, in the most terrifying way possible, that tomorrow is never guaranteed. His experience teaches us to cherish each moment with our loved ones, to never leave important words unsaid, and to recognize that what matters most isn't what we own or achieve, but who we love and how deeply we love them. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that persistence and righteousness will always lead to victory. When Elena refused to dismiss her daughter's words, when she trusted her own instincts despite the pressure to conform, she exhibited a courage that ultimately saved her family. In a world that often silences the voices of women and children, the Morrison family's experience stands as a testament to the power of speaking truth, even when that truth seems impossible. The sunlight faded, giving way to a sky full of stars. Thomas, Elena, and Emma remained on the porch, 3 hearts beating as one, bound by a love that had literally conquered death. Their story was just beginning, a story of healing, of second chances, and of a family whose bond was now unbreakable. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have trusted a child like Emma? Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories that remind us of the power of love and family. Your support means everything.